Alexandria, if you could go to the next slide. So to give you a sense of where we're headed this evening, after introducing the speaker, she's going to give a short presentation on tonight's theme, after which we're going to open up the floor for discussion, reflections, and questions. So start thinking of your questions as she's speaking. We'll then end with a couple short networking breakouts with smaller groups before closing. During the networking session, please feel free to approach myself or any other board member with any questions. And so if board members could right now, if you could just wave at your screen so everybody knows who the board members are. Okay, great, thank you. If you could go to the next slide. Oh, that's perfect. So as a reminder, given that we're in a virtual setting, please remain on mute until I call on you in the Q&A. You can either enter your questions in the chat function, or you can raise your hand via the Zoom functionality. Finally, please keep your video on. We want it to be as interactive as possible, especially during the Q&A. But if you're having audio issues, feel free to turn off your video. So without further ado, let me introduce our esteemed speaker, Professor Belinda Archibong. Professor Archibong is an assistant professor at Barnard College in the economics department. She received both her bachelor's as well as her Ph.D. from Columbia University. Her research investigates the role of historical institutions and the environment and inequality of access to public services and development of human capital, especially in African nations. Her recent work was covered and covered the effects of epidemics on gender gaps in human capital investment, the politics and economic burden of epidemic disease, the impact of air pollution on human capital outcomes. She's also an expert on the economics of prisons, gender gaps in political participation, and how public finance can promote or hinder gender gaps in labor markets. So we're all in for a treat, and I'll hand it over to you, Professor Archibong.
Thank you very much, Sandil. And thank you for the invite. Thank you all for coming. So actually, I will share some slides. So let me share my screen, and I will just talk a little bit about some of the research that I've done about this topic on climate change and kind of who bears the cost of climate change and thinking about it in the context of disease from what I've done. And then I look forward to the conversation afterwards and the Q&A as well. So let me share some slides very quickly. Okay, can everybody see this? Hopefully, yeah, okay, great. All right, so as Sandil said, I am an assistant professor of economics at Barnard College, Columbia University. My work is basically trying to understand what are the drivers of inequality, how do institutions and environment kind of contribute to widening inequalities around gender, around ethnicity, around race. And I do most of my work in Africa. So let me talk about a couple of projects, thinking about this theme about climate change and inequality, and then we can open up to conversation and discussion. I'm looking forward to hearing from you. So part of my work is to really kind of try and understand, as I said, what is the impact of environment, what is the role of climate change, especially in widening inequalities around the world, right? Especially among the most vulnerable populations in where I study, in places like many African countries. And really thinking about who bears the cost of climate change, right? So this is something that you hear a lot about, climate change being this big, market failure, as economists call it, right? So it's one of those things that we say government intervention is necessary because firms are not going to behave and reduce pollution on their own without it. But we don't really talk as much about who are the most vulnerable populations and who kind of bears the cost of global warming. So, this is the setting for a lot of my work. So thinking about the role of global warming, the role of rising global temperatures, and what the impacts of that will really be, right? So you guys, I'm sure, are familiar with this, but just to kind of give an overview, when we think about the impacts of global warming from the science, we say, look, we're talking more intense storms, so flooding, hurricanes, more of these kind of natural disasters. And then, what I study also thinking about disease and epidemics, which is something that we're thinking about right now, right? So really worsening the environment, or kind of making the environment more susceptible to more of these epidemics in the future, right? So this is really worrying. And so when we think about this, we say, okay, first of all, who bears the cost, right? So pollution that is driving this global warming is something that is being produced by firms all around the world. And we want to know, who, kind of bears the cost, and then who should pay, right? So thinking about who should we hold responsible when it comes to thinking about pollution costs, when it comes to thinking about policies, carbon taxes, things like that, that we, regulation that we can use, or we should use, to kind of address the issue of global warming that's driving a lot of this change and that will lead to a lot of this kind of catastrophe. So let me tell you briefly about two projects that I'm working on right now. And one is about thinking about the contribution of this type of epidemics caused or induced related to climate change, and thinking about how that affects women, right? So gender inequality. And that's one project that we have, and something that I'll tell you a little bit about. And then the next one is thinking about the things that firms are doing now, right? So oil and gas companies, fossil fuel burning is a huge contributor to the climate change problem, right? So when we think about the solution to this, we often say, as economists, we often say, well, we should pass something like a tax. We should pass a tax on carbon. We should make the polluters pay for the kind of costs associated with this pollution. Obviously, like the next question that then arises is, well, how much should they pay, right? So this project is really trying to understand, what are the impacts of air pollution from these oil and gas activities, from these big fossil fuel companies? How do they impact their local communities, right, that they operate in? How do they impact children and health and cognitive development among children? So this is something that, we're kind of currently working on two broad projects here. So let me tell you about the first project. So, Sub-Saharan African countries contribute some of the least to carbon emissions globally, right? So if you look at the kind of distribution of who emits the most, these are three different charts, one from 2007, one over since the kind of industrial revolution period. So when we start to see this uptick in burning of fossil fuel from the 18th century, late 18th century, and then this kind of per person, per capita distribution of emissions, right? So if you look at the kind of most recent, so this is 2007, but it looks very similar if you look at 2019, you see China as number one, the US is a close second, and then the EU countries as well, right? And you see like all of Africa, the African Union is way down the list in terms of thinking about who is actually contributing to this, right? So this is a picture that we talk about as kind of environmental economists when we think of who is contributing the most to emissions. Of course, the picture looks very different if you look at on a much longer time horizon, right? And this has been a point of contention for policy circles, right? So China says, look, when you're considering emissions that contributes to global warming, you can't just consider like today or this year or last year. You really have to look at the long history of emissions, right? So you have to go back to the 18th century, because for global warming, that's what really matters for climate change, right? So if you look at that picture, then the US and the EU dominate this list of who bears or who bears most of the kind of, if you will, like blame or fault for emissions. And again, the smaller countries, African countries, this is the Caribbean countries, the small island states, these are the countries that contribute the least on kind of any version of this ways of looking at carbon emissions. So we know that these countries, right, these African countries, small island states, thinking of the Caribbean, are contributing the least to climate change. However, we also know that many people in these countries are the ones that are going to bear most of the burden from global warming, right? So the epidemics, which I'll talk about, are much more prevalent in many of the tropics and are expected to worsen as a result of future and current global warming. So, when we think about policy and thinking about carbon pricing and taxes and regulation, we really need to factor all of these things in thinking about how, not just in terms of like, what is a fair way of setting the tax, but what is a fair way of setting the tax in such a way that it compensates, right, countries in the regions that are most vulnerable. So think of the Caribbean and in Africa for these kind of costs associated with global warming. So one of the projects that we did, we said, let's think about how epidemics in particular, right? So these epidemics that are induced by climate change or by climate affect gender inequality, right? So this is, again, a vulnerable population within a vulnerable population, thinking about women in Africa, right? And so what we did was we studied one country, we studied Niger, and we look at an epidemic that happened in 1986. And we said, we know that the weather, right, or climate rather, so the Harmattan season, which is the dry season in Africa, strongly predicts these meningitis epidemics, right? So the dry season extends from about October to about March, and you know, the environmental health people have shown that this is a big predictor for meningitis epidemics. And I'll talk about what meningitis is in a minute, but you know, very nasty disease, illness. Well, I guess I'll talk about it now. Nasty illness. It is a infection of the lining of the brain. Leads to fever, stiffness of the neck. In the worst case, you have neurological damage and you have death. Right. So extremely nasty disease has this climate driver. So what we did is to say, when this epidemic hits, how does it affect gender inequality? And specifically, how does it affect gender gaps in what we call, as economists, investment in human capital? So things like education, right? Which we know is really important for countries' development, because more educated you are, the higher the wages that you're able to command. And if higher wages you get, of course, you know, the more things you can consume, and that's how you kind of pull yourself out of poverty, or at least move up in the kind of income scale. So what we find is that when you see this epidemic hit, you know, higher exposure reduces the schooling for girls who were around the age to be in school when the epidemic hit. So school-going age girls, so between the ages of 6 to about 20, right? So think of like primary school, elementary school, and high school, and really significantly reduces the schooling for girls. No effect for boys. This is really concentrated on reducing schooling for girls. And so when we think about like, what is the primary mechanism where, you know, through like what's driving this? Why is this happening? What we find is that, you know, these epidemics are really, really costly for households, right? They're costly for poorer households, especially. And what happens when the epidemic hits is that you look at your children, you love your children equally, but maybe you can only spend, you know, you can only spend money for one when you know, you have these higher health costs because of the epidemic, or you have to miss work. Right? We're seeing what's happening with COVID right now. Right? People have to miss work, they have to stay home, you lose income. And so now all of a sudden your household budget is much tighter than you expected. So you say, okay, well, now I have to make the decision of investing in my boys and my girls. And you reduce the years of it, you reduce the investment in education in your girls. And also really interesting for this setting, right? And this is not just unique to Africa, this happens around the world, but something that we can identify here is that there is a cultural practice here of what we call bride price, right? So it's a, you know, when a woman is married, you see an exchange of wealth from the groom's family to the bride's family. So this is like really like an asset, like, you know, again, this is terms we use in economics. It sounds very strange, I know, but really like viewing women as assets, right? And so one of the things that parents say is like, okay, well, girl is not in school. I have to pull her out of school because, you know, or I never send her to school because now I have all these health costs, or, you know, just costs in general as a result of this epidemic. Well, I can also marry her off earlier, right? To be able to get her bride price a little bit earlier because the family is in need, the household really needs this income. So we see this reduced age at first marriage, the kind of probability of early marriage, of marrying before the age of 18, increases significantly for these girls also during this epidemic, right? So reduce schooling and increase the kind of risk of early marriage. So we know this from the development literature, that these are very, very negative long-term outcomes for not just women's welfare, but also household welfare in general, and for countries' welfare in general, right? You have this population of people, half your population, that's now, you know, getting less schooling, and hence less wages and less income and less consumption in the future, right? So this is something that we found, and really thinking again, if the costs are being disproportionately borne, right? The costs of these epidemics are being disproportionately borne by women. Who should bear this, like, you know, who should be responsible? How do we deal with this as policymakers or governments or as societies in general? So you know, this was the kind of the setting for our first project, and we did this. You know, you can I mentioned meningitis epidemic in Niger, but this is a problem that is endemic in much of sub-Saharan Africa. This is the picture of the countries that are affected by these epidemics. So the cycle is something like every 7 to 14 years, these countries get these meningitis epidemics. From Senegal to Ethiopia, about 23 countries, we're talking about 700 million people in Africa. So, you know, that was what we found. and was really, really, really worrying and disturbing. Again, thinking about who bears these costs. Women are really, really losing out when you have these kind of climate-induced epidemics. So the kind of second project that we thought maybe, was a little bit more encouraging was that we said, okay, I don't know if you guys remember this whole debate when COVID started, right? About whether or not the WHO, the World Health Organization, should declare a pandemic or whether they should declare an epidemic or not, right? And there was all this conversation about like, well, people will panic if we declare an epidemic or a pandemic, like why should we declare an epidemic now? The WHO should maybe hold off. And so we started thinking about, okay, when you have these types of epidemics, right? What is the role, or is there a role for organizations, international organizations like the WHO, to kind of mitigate the effects of these epidemics, depending on whether they declare an epidemic and kind of how they act in response to these shocks, right, to these health shocks. So what we did was we said, let's again look at that African meningitis belt that I showed you before, right? This one. Let's take 7 countries. We have data for 7 countries in this belt. And we have data over a long period from the 90s to 2008. And we said, let's look at what happens, right, when an epidemic hits. And then let's look at what happens when kind of the WHO declares that, hey, we are actually like in a kind of national epidemic in this country. So kind of think of it as the difference between I as an individual country, I as an individual district within a country, I might be seeing a lot of meningitis cases, right? So I'm in a kind of a local, what we call like a local epidemic. But if the level at the national level, right? So the WHO has strict standards. They say for meningitis, you have to have 100 cases per 100,000 population for it to be an epidemic. So if that national level is hit, then the WHO says, hey, we are now in an epidemic, it is an emergency. If, for instance, you are a small district or a state within a country like Niger or Nigeria, which is one of the countries we study, and you are experiencing basically what is epidemic levels, right? Like really unexpected high levels of meningitis. However, your national level does not reach the epidemic level, the 100 per 100,000 population threshold. WHO says, no, we're not going to declare an epidemic. So what we found was we said, okay, let's look at the impact of epidemics, right? These local epidemics, right? Where one state or one district is experiencing high unexpected levels of disease exposure, but the national level does not rise to WHO standards for an epidemic. And let's look at the impact of that on economic outcomes. So think of like economic activity, kind of like we use light density, which is like a proxy for per capita GDP. We look at health outcomes for children, infant mortality, whether the child is stunted or not, whether the child is underweight, the probability of getting vaccinations, like all these really important human capital outcomes for children. And what we find is that if you have this kind of local epidemic where a district or an area experiences this shock of disease, but the national level does not rise to the WHO standards for an epidemic level, so the WHO does not declare an epidemic, you see significant reductions in economic outcomes for these countries, right? So you have much lower kind of economic activity, you have more stunted children, you have more underweight children, and so you have all these negative outcomes basically that we are seeing now with COVID associated with having this local epidemic, but the WHO doesn't declare anything. However, when if the WHO declares that, hey, we're in a national epidemic, the level nationally has reached epidemic levels, you actually see a reversal in these results, right? So those areas that had really, really high levels of disease, but now the WHO declares that there's an epidemic in the country, they actually now do better than their counterparts, right? So they actually see more economic activity, they have less stunted children, they have less underweight children, right? And so what we show in that work is that what's really happening is that as soon as you have these international organizations, like a respected organization like the WHO declare an epidemic year, you see an influx of disaster aid, right? So you basically see like the World Bank funds more health projects in these areas, and they direct more funding to these places. And that funding is really, really essential in reversing these negative effects. And so this is like, thinking about the conversations we've been having in the US and also in many other countries around the world around like stimulus and the importance of stimulus. And all we economists are saying, you need to send money to vulnerable communities. You need to send money to black communities in the US are disproportionately being affected with these negative economic effects from COVID. the money, the resources are so important in reversing the kind of medium to long-term negative effects of these types of epidemics. And that's what we show in this work here. So I don't know how much time I have, but I'll say one more project and then I guess I'll stop. Yeah, okay, great. So again, just one more project in this environment, and thinking about, again, who bears the cost of climate change, who bears the cost of environmental pollution that is associated with climate change. This is more of a work in progress, and really being driven by saying, like, you know, we need to hold firms responsible, right? This is something that, like, literally we need to do to be able to reverse, you know, or not reverse, but mitigate the negative impacts of climate change. And the firms that are right now contributing the most to pollution that is driving a lot of this global warming are the fossil fuel companies, right? The oil and gas, the Exxons, the Shells, these types of people. And so in deciding and thinking about how much should they pay, we need to understand, well, how much costs are they imposing on the communities in which they are operating in? And so this is where this project comes from. We look at oil and gas in Nigeria, and we look at gas flaring. So basically, I don't know if you guys have ever, I don't know if I have a picture here. Do I have a picture? No, I do not have a picture. Well, actually, yes, I do. You know, if you see this picture here, this is like flames. You see this in Texas and North Dakota too, which are also oil and gas production areas in the US. Basically, the oil companies produce oil. There is gas mixed in the oil, but they see the gas as a waste product. So what they do is they burn off the gas, and it looks like this. You see these huge columns of flame. You're burning methane. This is releasing carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. But this is also like a source of significant local pollution, right? And this is something that we are studying, also trying to study in the US, because, you know, I think NIH is, people are worried that, like, look, what's happening to communities in places like North Dakota, Texas, that has these high levels of flaring. And so what we're trying to do is really kind of examine those costs, right? What are the costs for health, right? So you see a lot of, in a lot of the environmental health literature coming out from these areas, people complain about not being able to breathe because they have asthma, they have like all these like respiratory illnesses, people that live around these flaring areas, these oil and gas areas. And also that can affect, you know, there's a study that came out recently about like how heat and pollution affect children's performance in school, because, you know, it can affect cognitive development in school, it can affect memory. Some studies have shown from people have done some work in Europe that shows like exposure to these types of pollution can affect like children's ability to remember, which affects then their performance on tests and school more generally. So if we're able to pinpoint like what is actually the cost to communities and households as a result of this pollution, then we can really then say, okay, how do we set a pollution cost in terms of a tax that these oil and gas companies should pay, right? To you know, make them reduce the amount of pollution, but also to compensate. You know, again, I know these are like strange things, because it's like, how do you compensate for the loss to a child? But, you know, it's like, okay, we need the money to be able to at least like deal with treatment and all of these things for these communities. And also the lost livelihood, right? Many of these people are in agriculture or in fisheries, and oil and gas pollution is like really, really detrimental, can be really detrimental to local economies as well. So anyway, with that, I will stop there. There's a more project, but I'll stop there. And yeah, I'm looking forward to questions and discussion as well. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you very, very much. If I can start off as moderator. So we recently saw this UN report that warned that diseases that pass from animals to humans, I think these are zoonotics, like COVID, but also Ebola, MERS, HIV/AIDS, West Nile virus, that these are increasingly likely to emerge over time as basically humans impede all over. So that's via wildlife exploitation, via problematic agricultural practices, and then just climate change, of course. So is there an inherent tension that you see as an economist that also studies the environment between economic development on one hand and what the planet can withstand on the other hand, including our own sustainability as just humans on this planet?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think it really depends on how we view sustainability, right? So if we think about, so the way we think about it, or we talk about it at least in economics right now, in environmental economics, is to say, look, there are two types of sustainability. There is like strong sustainability where you say, look, we are going to make sure that the environment is preserved while we pursue economic growth, and we will not pursue any actions whatsoever that lead to environmental degradation, right? So that's like a really strong stance. So it's like no pollution, that's it. We don't do any actions that drive any type of like environmental loss. So that's one. The other one says, the weak sustainability says, well, you know, we should just pursue economic growth, and any environmental losses that we get, right? Any of the trees that are cut down or the pollution that we see, we can just replace it with like physical capital or machines and things in the future, right? And humanity will be fine. We'll just get air scrubbers that will scrub the atmosphere and give us clean air, and we'll be just fine, right? So clearly these are like two extremes, and very, very difficult to kind of, you know, take a stance on one or the other. The way I view it, again, you know, and I think many other people based on the work we've done, is that you're absolutely right that given the kind of current approach to economic development that we have now, that involves, you know, again, it's more of like a weak sustainability that says we just pursue economic growth and we'll worry about the environment in the future, then no, that is going to be disastrous for us. It's disastrous for us right now. We're all working from home, right? This is like, imagine like pandemics become a thing that is more frequent in the future, which is what a lot of the environmental health people are predicting, right? It's like a horrific thought, but it's like an actual real and present risk that we are facing right now. So if we continue business as usual, then no, it is impossible to say, you know, to have environmental preservation while also pursuing economic growth. So the kind of middle ground that a lot of us have been advocating for is to say, we need to think about, you hear this term green growth, right? So of course, economic development is important. It's very important for pulling a lot of people out of poverty, right? But we need to pursue that using kind of, you know, more, you know, things like renewable energy, more environmentally friendly technologies, and being mindful, right? This is like the sustainable development ideal, being mindful of how we use our environmental capital, right? Because that is really, really also, right? So this is something we do, like we talk about green accounting. It's like when we calculate our GDP, we don't factor in environment, but it's actually really, really important for GDP growth, right? So the more environment you have, you know, the better your environmental quality, the better the health of your people, the better your human capital, if you will, using the, you know, economics lingo, which means more GDP growth, more economic growth. So these things should not be in tension. Is how we, you know, like us, like in the environmental econ, like trying to push this idea. It doesn't have to be in tension. The kind of dichotomy that's being set up right now is a completely false dichotomy, and there is another road, which is this kind of green growth, green accounting way.
Fully aligned, and I think that even in the context of COVID, as economists, we've tried to talk about the fact that there's not this trade-off between dealing with the public health crisis on one hand and having a reopening, a thriving economy. You can't have a thriving economy until you deal with the public health crisis. Getting at the end of it. I'm gonna just bring in a couple audience members that have asked questions. So M. Boyer, if you could just unmute yourself and come in with your question.
I think not mute, it's still muted.
Yeah. Okay, I have two questions, yeah?
Mm-hmm.
The first one, you know, which is there, looks at the implications of climate change on Southern Africa and Southeast Africa in particular. You know, looking at, you know, the implications for Botswana and Southern Zimbabwe. And my question was, given that you have this big desert in the mid that goes from Southeast Angola through the Western Cape, does SADC or the AU have any programs of putting in a network of desalination plants that would transport water to some of the water-starved places like Botswana and Southern Zimbabwe? That's my first question. My second question refers to your talk about the Sahel and the question of, you know, desertification influenced by climate change leading to conflict over water scarcity and the issues of ethnic jihadi conflict that's going on there now in the Western Sahel. And what are the implications on gender, given, you know, given the increased number of displaced people and internal refugees?
No, thank you. These are again important questions. This is something that a lot of us that are working in this policy space or trying to work in policy space and research space in Africa are thinking about. On the first question on is the AU engaged in any kind of concerted efforts to do things like water transfers across different regions? So not to my knowledge. And I think, well, this is it's part of a larger problem/issue that, to be fair, the kind of AU members have been trying to tackle right now on the lack of connectivity between different regions in Africa, right? So we have the AU, which is politically the organization that has all the African states, and we have the connectedness in that way. But in terms of thinking about concrete economic connections and economic plans, that has been something that has been lagging in Africa for a very long time. And so it's reflected in things like, the fact that we don't have this type of water transfer systems that you mentioned, at least to my knowledge. Currently, I do know that they have engaged in things like, I think there's like a West Africa grid program that people have put in place to try and transfer electricity from different regions at least in West Africa. I know I was talking to, I forget who, from the Trade Commission. And I know that they're trying to do this kind of free movement of labor, EU type thing, and extend that to African countries or AU countries as well. That will allow for, well, maybe not free movement of labor, but free movement of capital. The labor, as you alluded to in your second question, is a very tricky and more contentious issue. But at least for free movement of capital, they'll make it cheaper for African businesses to work with each other. And so I think once we can form this type of economic connections, then we can start thinking more concretely about the kind of necessary infrastructure investments and connections that you mentioned, like the water transfers. So do something similar with like they're doing with the electricity and the kind of natural gas pipeline. I think they have, it's the pipeline, it's not electricity, the national gas pipeline that they have in West Africa, and extending those types of connections to the rest of the continent. I think for the second one, yes. I mean, I mention this, I say this all the time because it's work I do in my research. Any type of shocks to economies and societies more generally will disproportionately affect women, because women are oftentimes, on average, in a more vulnerable economic position in countries around the world, including the US, as we're seeing right now with the epidemics. On the free movement of labor and thinking about, what happens in conflict regions or conflict zones, again, it's a very contentious issue. My stance is often that, yes, we should have freer movement of labor. We should let people move, especially people that are coming from conflict regions. We should allow them to access safer environments. And I think that will be better for women as well, right? If women women coming from conflict zones can access safer regions in the continent, this will improve welfare. Of course, as you alluded to, there are tensions. There are tensions anytime you have an influx of migrants into any country. And that's something that politically, I think, is something that we have to work through. And it's something that we have to kind of talk about and kind of really show people that migrants are not here to harm you on average. They are coming and escaping from horrible situations and are trying to also participate in the community just as you are. But again, this is a more complex conversation that needs to be had, not just in Africa, but we're having right now in the US, right, with immigration laws and all of that. But yes, it's important points here.
Sarah Travis, if you want to come in and ask your question.
Sure. Thank you so much. I thought this was a fantastic presentation, Dr. Archibong, so thank you. My question is around political will, and from your perspective, what you think are effective incentives to kind of generate this shared sense of responsibility around climate change, around how it negatively impacts women more than others, and just kind of that type of political will.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. It's something that, as economists, we say, look, we know the solution, and we tell people there are tax systems, there are regulatory systems that can address the climate change issue. But as you said, the political will is what is missing, right? This is like the China-US conversation or debate, that I mentioned earlier, right? So China says it's not fair that you guys want us to pay the same tax as the US, because the US has been, if you look from the 18th century, the US has been polluting more than we have in the last year, right? And I think the key here is to really try, like, and again, it's very, very difficult, right? But it's something we need to do, to make people understand that just because one group is being disproportionately affected does not mean that we all, as a kind of global community, are not going to bear the brunt of climate change, right? And this is something that I always say, like, the environment has no it doesn't know boundaries, doesn't know borders, right? Pollution doesn't know borders. It won't matter in the end. Yes, okay, women will be disproportionately affected. African nations, island nations are going to be disproportionately affected, but it's still going to come to us in the US. It's going to come to the US, it's going to come to Europe. It's not something that anyone can run from, right? And I think really, like, this is a message that really, really, really needs to be emphasized, right? That this is a global problem, a global kind of, I mentioned this word market failure, that needs all of us to come to the table and kind of make, decisions and policies to deal with this. And people, for a time, I was optimistic. The US signed the Paris Agreement. It was like all these countries signed the Paris Agreement. It was a golden era, pre the current administration. And there was a time when we were like, okay, we're getting there, but we'll see what happens in the next few years. But I think you're absolutely right. We know what to do. It's about the political will. And I think really driving home to citizens in their countries, like telling people that, look, this is a global problem, vote the politicians, vote the policies that will address this. And don't be, because a lot of times politicians, will do these like, oh, well, it's those people versus those people, in group versus out group. And they do it very instrumentally because they're trying to win votes. They're trying to attain their own political power. And it's up to us as citizens to make sure that we don't get sidetracked by that, And so, this is, I know it's not like a specific policy response, unfortunately, but I think it's something that I'm optimistic that, again, as we are, it's much easier to spread this information now, right? And as we're more connected and as we're communicating more, maybe now as we're all in lockdown and everyone's paying attention to these things, I think this is something that people hopefully will come to really realize in the next few years at the very least.
Great. And are there any other questions at this time? Does anyone want to unmute themselves and ask a question?
Hello, this is Cynthia Kuite. I just want to follow up on the comment that Sarah made, which I think was incredibly good, and also to thank you very much for your presentation. I also concur that it was excellent. When we discuss political will, I think we cannot ignore the issue of corruption. And I don't know if you'd like to say a few words about that. I mean, certainly from my experience in Africa, served in several tours, I thought corruption was the biggest issue in terms of thwarting development and addressing a lot of the issues that you just raised in your presentation.
Yeah, I mean, no, again, this is it's an important point. Well, let me tell you a story, because this is something that I've also always said, corruption is the issue, and I found that it's in my experience maybe a little bit more like complex than we often say when we say corruption, right? Because you can say like corruption is in every country. Here in the US, it's in Nigeria, in Ghana, it's in the UK. And so what I have found, I've been working with policymakers in Nigeria, talking to government officials. They're like on the kind of civil servant bureaucrat level, there are so many people that are working incredibly hard to rid the system of corruption, right? And I felt, I mean, to be frank, I also felt like a little bit ashamed myself when I went and I talked to people, because I went with like my US, like, yes, corruption, like, this is the issue. And then you talk to people at the like National Testing Agency that are they're telling you about how, look, I know corruption is an issue. I am trying to make sure that these parents who are trying to basically like come and pay for their students, for their children to get fake scores on like the African SAT, call it the West African exams, WIAC, and trying to bribe officials to like give them the answers or change scores. They come to me, these are parents who, they're not just rich, they're also themselves government officials. And they say, you know, they first give you money, then they threaten you, then they threaten your family, and they say like all these things to try and get you to engage in corruption. And they'll, you know, a couple of people talked to me and they were like, we really struggle and we really try. And we wish people would know more about the fact that these, like us as the kind of middle management bureaucrats, are really trying really hard. They're not to say that they're not people that are completely corrupt, but they're like many people like fighting against corruption at this kind of bureaucrat level. So I think, you know, the more support and the more of a spotlight that we can shine on those people, and the more, and again, this is, you know, of course, the institutions themselves are a huge problem, right? It's not gonna, like, shining a spotlight on these people is not gonna solve corruption, not at all. But I think it's an important part of changing on this political will, of changing kind of citizens' perceptions of what is possible, right? Because you talk to many people, not just in Nigeria, in Africa, and here in the US, and there are people who rightly are completely disillusioned with their political institutions. And they will say, like, what's the point, right? What's the point of me fighting corruption? Or what's the point of me coming to talk about, you know, X and X is corrupt? Like, there's no point. They're gonna be corrupt anyway. I might as well just go with the system. So I think really when you highlight that, hey, you're not alone in this fight, there are many of us who are trying to make the system better. I think that kind of political will from the kind of, again, I know it sounds very kumbaya, but it's like, I believe, you know, top down level, or sorry, bottom up level, kind of, you know, getting people to say and see that there are people fighting against this, and it is possible to fight against this even within the system. That's important. Of course, for long-term change, we need kind of top down, you know, policy and institutional change. You know, I'm optimistic again from many African countries that this is possible. You know, I've seen, there was a report, I think in Ghana, there's some journalists who have been like exposing corruption in the legal judicial system, and got a lot of Ghanaian citizens really, really involved and really aware, and people are now really fighting against it, like against judicial corruption in Ghana. So the way I see it, we need to break down, these are huge problems, right? So we need to break this down into pieces and address them. So say, okay, let's talk about the civil service. Let's talk about the bureaucrat's office. Let's talk about the judicial office. Now let's talk about private sector. And I think once we are able to break these pieces down and tackle corruption in this way, in this kind of piecemeal way, again, it's not gonna be like a huge panacea to solve the whole thing, but I think it gets us a bit closer to saying, how do we make sure that corruption is not an impediment to development in African countries or in these countries in general.
Can I just make one comment, just to thank you for that. And when I was addressing corruption in Africa, and when I talk to leaders and I talk to community, I start off by saying, corruption is a human condition. Look at it in the United States. I'm not trying to pinpoint only African countries. It's just that often the impact is felt so much stronger because of the disparity in incomes. And the other thing I often mention is how important it is to have, which you just referred to, strong institutions and transparency.
Transparency, exactly right.
Other questions? Feel free to unmute yourself and come on in. Perhaps while people think of their questions, I've got a couple on your research. So the first was in the context of this finding on gender in epidemics, and that women are disproportionately losing out in so many ways. What we're seeing here in the US with COVID is that women are also disproportionately losing their jobs. And then even with this temporary moment of a recovery for the last couple months, those jobs are not coming back. And so it does seem like we need more gender conscious policies when we're interacting all of these different crises on top of the pandemic. What does that look like? Is it more childcare credits? What's the kind of first best in this world of the pandemic interacting with economic crises?
Yeah, I mean, definitely it was a good question. We're seeing this in the US as well. So this is something where I think it's kind of a two-stage issue, right? So we're seeing that, for instance, I've seen some research come out recently that women are engaging in much more kind of care work at home and unpaid care work than their male counterparts and their male partners often, even if both are working like in a kind of paid sector work. And so on a kind of micro scale, that's a problem, right? Like I've been seeing, and Sanil, I don't know if you've seen these articles on Twitter with like the number of women economists that are submitting papers versus like the number of women economists that are submitting. It's like all these men are like, yes, we have so
Very
much
productive.
time. Very productive. And the women are like, where is the time? and so it's interesting to me on that kind of micro household level, because we all say we have progressive views, towards gender and towards gender equality, and everyone's for gender equality. And this is something where we're like, okay, we have to push against the kind of cultural norms within households on a kind of first stage, right? Like why are you doing more care work than your partner, kind of thing, I mean, we know why, but it's like, but that shouldn't be, And then of course, on the macro scale, super important, right? This goes back to, kind of the push that people have been talking about for, we need more paid leave for women, especially like, in terms of both paternity and maternity leave. We need more accessible, kind of, equitable access to childcare, so that women like have outside sources. I mean, of course, not during the pandemic. It's again, this is like we're all at home, so it's like hard. But after the pandemic, making sure that women can easily return to work if that's what they want, like that needs to be in place, and that needs to be something that is accessible and in terms of income and in terms of cost to everyone, right? People have been saying government should be investing in like, childcare that is accessible for especially low-income families, and especially this is like disproportionately affecting Black women, right? This is what we're finding, and where a lot of Black women right now in the U.S. are in this kind of double bind, where on the one hand, disproportionately, represented in the kind of essential sectors, right? So I have relatives who have like home health aides, and they're most at risk now from COVID because they're working with like vulnerable populations and they have to work. But on the other hand, also now they're facing kind of increased unpaid care work in their homes. So it's like this kind of double increase and double cost that people are facing. So that's an issue, right? That's an issue in terms of the national policies around why is it that, people in these essential, so-called essential positions, like, home health aides or healthcare workers or groceries or kind of lower paid sectors, why do they not have, kind of unemployment benefits or insurance or good health insurance or accessible, why are we not talking about universal healthcare? So these are the kinds of policies on the macro level that needs to be in place, and that needs to be targeted to the more vulnerable populations, to women and Black women in particular, to really make sure that the kind of short-term negative effects we're seeing on women don't become, or don't last in the kind of medium to long run. But anyway, I've been saying these things
for a long time, and it's like, where is the change?
Yeah.
No, I agree. I have this sense that in the aftermath of this, given that what we talked about earlier in terms of the increasing incidence of these types of pandemics as well, that there's going to be a reevaluation that amplifies the gender gap, right? So corporates will say, listen, if we're going to have this situation, we're going to have to suddenly take over your home care work, your home production every few years. Do I really want to hire a woman that has children, that has a family? So it makes everything that's been going on even worse.
Yeah.
So we've got another question from N. Boyer. If you want to come in and unmute yourself.
Yeah, I guess the question that I have is, this is like the fifth or sixth virus that has crossed species in recent years, in the last 10, 15 years. I mean, if you talk about H1N1, you talk about swine flu, if you talk about SARS, if you talk about MERS, the Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, and now COVID. So I guess the question is, looking at what we're dealing with now and the impact on communities of color and sisters in particular, what are the mechanisms that we need to put in place for the next pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we've been thinking of. It's an important question. I'll go back to what I said about the macro level things, right? This is where, government, I know in econ we often say like, government intervention and all of that, but this is where you actually really need government intervention in healthcare, accessible healthcare, making sure that, you know, if, for example, you see like, okay, well, this is a shock, we don't know when the next parasite, bacterium, virus is going to come from. Given that, you should have in place that, you know, everyone has access to preventable or it's kind of preventive care. Like everyone is going to the doctor regularly and can do that regularly, right? So that, you know, the kind of pre-existing conditions that people were mentioning, people kept mentioning, oh, Black people have, you know, more pre-existing conditions, and that's why you're seeing the racial disparities in COVID mortality rates in the United States, and Black people are disproportionately dying at higher rates. It's like, why is that the case, right? So it's the kind of racism existing in healthcare that has, you know, it placed barriers to access to healthcare, to preventive healthcare for Black populations, for Black communities in the US for a very long time, right? And not just that, it's again, the story of the labor market, right? So it's like, who is in these essential sectors? Why is it that it's Black women that are disproportionately, and Black people generally in these, you know, Black and Hispanic people in these, you know, essential vulnerable sectors, and why don't they have the kind of protection that they need? You know, again, this goes back to, this is like 1930s, you have the Fair Labor Standards Act that passes the minimum wage. The US is part of the US New Deal, supposed to be this great thing, but excluded deliberately, I would say, according to historians, excluded certain sectors, these kind of essential care sectors, right? Domestic service sectors, where Black people were disproportionately represented in. It's like, why is that? Well, again, it goes back to the history of racist, like labor market discrimination practices in the US. So this is something that, you know, as individuals, we cannot tackle alone. This is something where the people that have the power to institute wide-scale institutional change, that is government, need to change everything from access to healthcare. Universal healthcare is a must. Need to have, you know, enforce kind of, you know, these kind of, or have more protection for these essential care sectors or domestic service sectors, right? So more protection in terms of, you know, people need to know that if they don't work, that if they're able to at least survive and earn a living wage, a living income. You know, more protection in terms of, you know, labor market discrimination suits and enforcing those. But also thinking about the kind of underlying thing that is the haunting, that's been haunting us in the US, which is the racial wealth disparities, right? And seeing this situation where people are still going and engaging in this risky labor market because they don't have savings, they don't have access to any other capital to tide them over when you have a pandemic, right? So why is that? And this is something where, you know, I have colleagues, Eric Hamilton and Darity, you know, economists who have been working on all of these kind of policies that we call baby bonds. Government should have a savings program for children from low-income families to make sure that families have these types of savings, government-funded savings, that, you know, when a pandemic hits, when a shock hits, they're not like left having to go and work and, you know, put themselves at risk from catching COVID. You know, so it's a number of different things on the labor market, on addressing, you know, racial wealth gaps with these types of government-funded savings, on universal healthcare. These are type of policies that need to happen, but can only happen on a macro scale from the government level. That will then address the disproportionate risk being borne by Black people and Black women in particular, so that this doesn't happen. And we're, you know, these, you know, our populations are not more affected if you have another pandemic in the future.
Excellent, thank you. So we've got time for one last burning question from the audience. If anyone wants to come in with one final question.
I want to definitely,
yes,
I definitely want to ask a question. Thank you so much for organizing this great discussion. And I wanted to really thank Professor, because it really touched on all of the issues that I raised when I thought about having this kind of a event, because I saw such an intersection between what's happening with the COVID-19 crisis, and as the last speaker alluded to, this rise in pandemics that's interlinked with climate change. And so I just wanted to ask if in her economic circles, she's heard some of what they're going to be doing in terms of the research from the United Nations, the World Bank Group, and other international financial institutions on understanding these linkages, because clearly the rise in climate change will be bringing more pandemics and epidemics across the planet. And so how the response comes from the policy community seems like it's going to be a huge reflection on the research that economists like yourself will be conducting. So just giving us an update on other things you're seeing that are positive, optimistic signs that the academics are taking on this research, they're finding the linkages, they're bringing them forward to policymakers. Because I have to be honest, I brought this idea up because I heard something from a United Nations environmental program economist, environmentalist on a BBC program. But subsequently, I haven't heard about it anymore in a lot of the media and communication circles. So give us some signs of hope and optimism that the research will increase, people will see the linkages, and it will move the policymakers perhaps more to take on climate change and really address what needs to be done to reduce all of our carbon footprints worldwide that causes all these problems with the increase of epidemics and pandemics coming into the human community from different species. So really appreciate your presentation and your answers to these questions, and appreciate your time. And my name is Allison. Thank you.
No, thank you. Allison, it's an important point on the policy side. I will say, anecdotally, I had to motivate my epidemic. I've been doing this epidemics work for years. And it used to be that when I would talk to policy people or other academics, I would have to say, and this is why you should care about epidemics, because climate change might make it worse. And now people are like, no, you don't have to explain to us. We understand there's climate change, it's a problem. So people, I think, anecdotally, academics at least they're on board, and there's a lot of research coming out right now on both thinking about pandemics, so focus on COVID, but also thinking about environmental pollution more generally and its contribution to climate change and how that affects health, right? So there's a lot of work coming out right now on air pollution and respiratory illnesses and how that makes people or puts people at a higher risk from COVID. So on the research side, I would say that's reassuring, there's a lot of research coming out. So the Lancet Medical Journal, they also just released this huge report on thinking about the links between climate change and epidemics as well. So many of these kind of big academic organizations are releasing research that is really focused on this issue and really making this link and trying to get people to understand these links between climate change, air pollution from environmental pollution that contributes to climate change, and epidemics. On the policy side, that is still, in my experience, that's still a bit trickier, is what I found. So government agencies, in my experience, tend to be very siloed in their thinking, and it's very hard to get them to think out of their silos for understandable reasons, right? They're kind of competitive resources. People are like, I am the environment industry. If you want epidemics, go talk to the CDC guys, the health guys, right? Don't come talk to me. So this has been my experience. So people will be like, I'm like, no, but you understand that the environment people are salient for the disease people, right? Like the health people, these things are linked, they're not independent. And they're like, no, we're different ministries, we're different agencies. And that happens both in the government work I've done in Nigeria, but also talking to people at the bank. I worked with the World Bank for a little while, right? Everyone is in their own little silo. There's that we work on gender, and we work on health, and I'm like, well, you guys need to talk to each other because these things are linked. So I think what might help in that respect, and this is something that we've been trying to do at Columbia, because I'm part of the Earth Institute at Columbia, and we try and think more interdisciplinarily, is getting money and resources, grants, explicitly with this kind of interdisciplinary or making those connections explicitly between climate, environment, and epidemics, right? And also things like gender and all these important social inequality impacts. So I think if we can get, and I'm not sure how to do this, I think we've been trying to do this, at Columbia with the Earth Institute. They're trying to fund a whole climate school right now that will fund people to do this work and will get policymakers to come into these spaces to say, look, you don't have to compete over the resources, we'll give you the money so you can link, you can work on these issues and linking these issues explicitly, addressing and creating policy to link these issues explicitly. I think that's going to be an important part of getting policymakers to move in that direction. So academia, moving already in that direction. No need, in my experience. Policy, it's a bit slower, but I think that has had to do with like the politics of resource distribution. And if we can loosen some of the kind of constraints around the resource distribution, like having money, saying like, if you work in these policies jointly, we'll give you the money to work on it. I think that will go a long way in getting policymakers on board to think about these things as linked.
Thank you. That was such a perfect point to end on. Forward looking and then inspirational in terms of like, we need to now go back and do the work, including nudging our institutions along in basically just dealing with intersectionality in a credible manner. So I know that we're in a virtual environment, but before we switch to the networking session, I wanted everybody to give her a round of applause. We're really appreciative for Professor Archibong for being here. So if you can unmute yourself briefly and clap. We're gonna try this. Ready? 1, 2, 3.
Yay!
Thank you so much.
Yay!
Thank you very, very, very much.
Thank you.
So we are now going to move into 2 brief networking sessions, about 10 minutes each. Alexandria is going to put us